Hello BookTube, I'm Jonathan and welcome to Words in Time. Now in today's video I'm going to be talking about the 5th season, the first book in the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. So what is the premise? Well, the 5th season follows 3 storylines. First we have a man and woman that travel across an empire that experiences constant seismic events. We also have a woman that has recently experienced a family tragedy. And lastly, we have a young girl that is sent to an organization that trains people with special abilities. So, before I get into my actual review, I just wanted to talk about the quality of this paperback, which I didn't love. Normally I do love my paperbacks, but the paper in this one is a little bit grainy and little bits of paper off the side when I was reading it would just fly off into the air. I felt like, despite the fact that this is a new book, I felt like I was reading some dusty old book that I'd found in the basement. And you guys are probably going to think that I'm exaggerating, but the first few times I read this in bed, every time I turned the page, so much little dust flecks of book would fly off into the air, land in my mouth, and make me start coughing. It was ridiculous. So anyway, that has no impact on my score for the book. I just wanted to say, Orbit, not your best work. So I wanted to start with the world building, as that was one of my favorite aspects of the book. The 5th season takes place in a world that constantly experiences natural disasters, such as earthquakes, volcano eruptions, tsunamis, and every few centuries the world also experiences what is known as a 5th season, which is an apocalyptic-sized event. So I thought this was a pretty rich world to set the story in, because we get to see how that kind of world affects both individuals as people as well as entire societies. Because your life, everyday life, becomes just about surviving the day, but also about how to prepare to rebuild when civilization inevitably falls once again. I think it also creates an interesting in-world concept of their history, because as societies rebuild after these 5th seasons, a lot of what they learn and what is passed on is what actually happened. It's real history. But also a lot of the ideas, the concepts of what happened previously is very much based on myth or legend. So I found that a really interesting combination. Next, I wanted to talk about the plot. And for the first 50 to 100 pages, I found it a little tough to follow what was going on. I think after that 100-page mark, after I got to learn a little bit more about the characters, learned a little bit more about the world, I found the book a little bit easier to follow. However, I would say that for me, the plot still did lack a little bit of direction. I reread the Goodreads blurb for this book after I had finished and thought, that's not exactly the book I remember reading. And it wasn't so much that that description was wrong, per se, so much as I think the book only spent a small amount of time following those particular plot ideas and devoted a lot more time focusing on other things. To me, this felt a little bit like an open world game where you put the main mission to the side for a while and you start following all of the side quests. And individually, on their own, they're all somewhat interesting, but together they're not really connected and they don't build to anything in particular. You're kind of just ranking up. While reading the 5th season, I felt like I was making progression through the pages, but I wasn't really progressing towards anywhere in particular. And that was kind of my feeling towards the plot, kind of for the majority of the book. Now, in regard to themes and concepts, perhaps the most interesting theme for me in the book was the treatment of the Origines. Now, Origines are people with the ability to interact with the Earth. For example, they have the ability to stop an earthquake or something like that. And interestingly, they aren't treated as heroes. Rather, they are treated as second-class citizens and essentially used as slaves. And they are referred to with the derogatory slur of roggers. Now, I think there was some interesting social commentary here, and it can be tough to balance social commentary, your use of it in a book, because if it's rather heavy-handed, if you push very far in that direction, it can sometimes take you out of the experience, out of the world that we are in, and kind of detract from the rest of the experiences that you might be enjoying within the book. But if it's included but you don't take it very far, then it can also just come across as somewhat surface level commentary. So it's a tough thing to navigate, and for me in the 5th season, what I wanted was just to be taken a little bit further in terms of adding a twist to it or revealing another layer that would take what for me was still quite interesting, but to take it to another level that for me would have been really thought-provoking. Now, there were a few other ideas and concepts in the book, such as the Stone Eaters, which I found to be relatively interesting, but all of them seem to be intentionally mysterious. My guess is that those things will be explored later on in the series, because for me, what we got in the 5th season so far wasn't particularly entertaining or satisfying to me. So we'll find out what happens with those later on, I guess. Now, I just wanted to touch on the genre of the book. As I mentioned in my TBR video, I do want to focus on sci-fi for the channel, but I'm not going to be super strict on that. I definitely am open to reading sci-fi/fantasy hybrids, etc., and that is how this book was pitched to me. Now, having read it, personally, I would say that it is fantasy with some post-apocalyptic and dystopian aspects to it, which you may consider to be part of sci-fi. Now, outside of the natural disasters, which you could consider to be environmental science, there's really only one other small concept that I noticed as being a sci-fi concept. Overall, the majority of this read more like fantasy to me. And that's totally okay. That didn't affect my score. I didn't mind that at all. I just wanted to share that with you, just so you guys know, in case you have a preference for, or you're in the mood for, one particular genre over the other. So in terms of the writing style, this book is split into 3 POVs. Now, interestingly, 2 of those are told in the 3rd person, and one of which is told in the 2nd person, as in, you said this, and then you did that. Now, I've heard a few people say that this didn't really work for them, they didn't particularly like it. For me, I would say it didn't really bother me at all. My issue with this section of the book, these POV chapters, were more to do with the fact that I think it had the least clear plot progression, and I didn't really care for any of the characters that were in it. Speaking of the characters, I would say my favorite was probably Demaya, and she is the young girl that is training to become an Origine. She was probably one of the only characters that wasn't immediately unlikable, and her storyline has a few moments that for me were reminiscent of Ender's Game or Harry Potter, which I quite enjoyed. I would guess the storyline that we spend the most amount of time with is probably Cyanide and Alabaster, and they have a very awkward and uncomfortable relationship, and it's intentionally uncomfortable. I don't know if either of them are particularly likable, but they're probably the characters with the most depth, and I wasn't particularly invested in either of them, but they were also probably the most rewarding to learn more about. So overall, what did I think of the 5th season? Well, I think this book has some excellent world building and explores a few interesting themes. However, I was never particularly engaged by the plot, and I was never overly invested in the characters. So even when there were some interesting moments or reveals later on in the book, it didn't have the emotional impact, or it didn't land as hard for me as it would have otherwise. I think if you are looking for a book that is somewhat grim and uncomfortable and mysterious, then this could be a good book for you. However, ultimately, I don't think this book really was for me. As a score, I'm going to have to give the 5th season 5.5 out of 10. I was pretty mixed on this one, although I did like the last 20-30 pages or so, which bumped it up half a notch to a 5.5. Not sure if it's going to be enough for me to continue the series. Maybe you guys can convince me in the comments, because I've heard mostly positive things about the 5th season. It is a Hugo Award winner, but I have heard a few other people say it didn't quite land for them either. So if you haven't read it, let me know whether you're interested. If you have read it, let me know your thoughts, whether you agree with me, whether you disliked it. I didn't dislike it, but if you disliked it, or if you liked it, what were some of your favorite aspects that perhaps didn't land for me? So there you go, guys. I hope you enjoyed the review. If you did, make sure to like and subscribe, because even though I said this was a little bit more fantasy than sci-fi, there's always more sci-fi content coming soon.